Madbury, New Hampshire, was the kind of place most people imagined when they thought of small-town America. Tree-lined roads, tidy colonial homes, and the soft rhythm of neighbors who waved when they passed by. It was a town where serious crime felt distant, more like something from a television drama than an actual threat. Emily Long, 42 years old, was known to friends and acquaintances as a devoted mother and an energetic personality. To the outside world, she looked like a woman juggling the ordinary challenges of life, raising children, supporting her husband, managing her career. She posted family photos on social media, smiling snapshots of summer barbecues, children's school events, and holiday gatherings. These images painted the Long family as the kind of suburban success story many aspired to replicate. Her husband, Michael, worked steadily in a local business. Their children, a daughter and a son, were seen around the neighborhood, riding bikes in the driveway and playing in the yard. Neighbors would later recall how normal they seemed, the type of family that blended seamlessly into the community. In Madbury, a town with fewer than 2,000 residents, everyone knew at least a little bit about it forming inside the Long home. Beneath the surface, Emily was living a life weighed down by pressures she kept well hidden. She had a reputation for being a sharp dresser, someone who liked new outfits, fresh decor, and the little luxuries that made a house feel like a home. But those purchases carried a cost, one that was steadily sinking the family into financial strain. On social media, she appeared carefree, even glamorous at times. Behind closed doors, bills piled up, debts whispered of trouble, and arguments simmered when the budget simply didn't stretch far enough. Still, nothing about the Longs suggested they were headed for disaster. Teachers at school described Emily as an involved mother. Local store clerks remembered her as polite, if sometimes hurried, and relatives described her as protective of her children, the kind of parent who worried about their grades, their friends, their safety. The portrait she presented was not one of danger, but of devotion. That is what makes what happened in August 2025 so haunting. Because in communities like Madbury, tragedy is supposed to come from the outside, from strangers, from freak accidents, from the things nobody can predict. It was never supposed to happen in the Long household, under the roof of a mother who once promised to keep her family safe. As police reports would later confirm, the warning signs were faint but present. A shopping addiction that drained accounts, questions at her workplace about missing funds, stress she disguised with smiles and carefully posed photographs. And yet, no one truly believed Emily Long was capable of violence, least of all against the very people she loved most. But on that summer evening, the facade of perfection shattered. The home that looked so ordinary became the center of a crime so unthinkable that it stunned even hardened investigators. Before long, reporters would flood into Madbury. Neighbors would stare at camera crews in disbelief. And the question that echoed from every street corner to every national headline was simple. From the outside, the Long household in Madbury still looked like a picture of balance. But inside, subtle fractures were spreading through the family's foundation. Emily Long carried herself with an air of control, yet the truth was that she was fighting a battle against debt, denial, and desperation. Friends would later admit that Emily seemed to always have something new. New clothes, new furniture, little luxuries that made her house look more polished than her neighbors. She took pride in appearances, and in a town where gossip traveled quickly, it mattered to her that people believed she was doing well. What no one realized was that her spending habits had become something darker, an addiction. Shopping wasn't just a hobby for Emily, it was a coping mechanism. Receipts stacked up, online orders arrived in a steady stream, and credit cards were pushed to their limits. The thrill of the purchase gave her relief, a temporary escape from the quiet anxiety she felt pressing down on her. But with every bag she carried through the door, her family's financial reality grew heavier. Her husband, Michael, was not blind to the strain. Arguments behind closed doors grew sharper. Bills were delayed, accounts were overdrawn, and the family's savings began to erode. Emily, however, insisted that she had everything under control. She masked her stress with determination, and when Michael questioned her, she often turned defensive, as if admitting the problem would unravel her carefully constructed image of stability. The tension seeped into everyday life. Small disagreements over money turned into bitter disputes. The children summoned the cause. To the outside world, the Longs remained that ordinary suburban family, but within their walls, silence and strain became more frequent companions. In early 2025, whispers began to surface at Emily's workplace. She was a trusted employee, but questions arose when irregularities appeared in financial accounts she handled. At first, they were brushed aside as errors, miscalculations, small mistakes that anyone might make. But as weeks passed, the numbers stopped adding up. Missing funds, unexplained transactions, and growing suspicions slowly painted a troubling picture. Investigators would later allege that Emily had been embezzling money from her employer, channeling funds to cover the very debts her shopping had created. It was a vicious cycle. The more she bought, the more she owed. The more she owed, the deeper she sank into secrecy. Still, she managed to keep this double life hidden from her friends, her children, even from Michael. On social media, Emily maintained the performance. She posted cheerful photos, updates about family outings, and positive quotes that suggested gratitude and joy. But beneath each smiling picture was a woman unraveling, cornered by pressures she could no longer manage. Those who knew her casually might have described her as upbeat, maybe a little stressed, but never dangerous. Yet the cracks were there, clear to anyone willing to look closely. Her spending was excessive, her stress was mounting, and when people who carry so much refuse to ask for help, the weight can twist into something unrecognizable. By the summer of 2025, Emily Long's world had become a carefully maintained illusion. She stood between two realities, the one she showed the world, and the one collapsing quietly behind closed doors. Every secret she kept tightened the trap she had built for herself, and when the walls finally caved in, the result was in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, Emily Long's online presence painted a picture of calm. Her social media accounts showed smiling selfies, inspirational quotes, and photos of family dinners that appeared warm and ordinary. To casual observers, nothing seemed amiss, but to those who looked closer there were signs, subtle, unsettling signs, that something beneath the surface was beginning to fracture. Her captions often hinted at exhaustion. One day at a time, she posted in late June, followed by another, holding it together even when it's hard. Most people scrolled past without much thought, but in retrospect, these words felt like hidden cries for help, masked beneath emojis and cheerful backdrops. Offline, the atmosphere in the Long household grew tense. Emily's relationship with Michael was strained, and their disagreements often spilled into late-night arguments. The children sensed the tension, growing quieter around the dinner table, unsure when their mother's mood might swing from calm to irritable. Even neighbors noted that Emily seemed less social, avoiding casual conversations she once enjoyed. Financial stress loomed larger than ever. Bills piled up, and debt collectors' calls became routine. Emily became increasingly defensive whenever Michael pressed her about money. She would dismiss his concerns with quick explanations or brush them aside, insisting she had it under control. But in truth, the weight was unbearable. At work, the whispers grew louder. Auditors were closing in on irregularities, and Emily's facade of control began to crumble. She became more withdrawn, often leaving the office looking drained, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Co-workers later recalled her nervousness, the way she avoided eye contact when questioned about missing funds. The once confident, meticulous employee now seemed cornered. Her spending, however, didn't slow. Packages still arrived at the house. New items quietly appeared in her wardrobe and around the living room. Shopping remained her escape, the only way she knew to temporarily silence the gnawing anxiety. But the more she spent, the closer she came to the edge. Family friends would later recall moments when Emily seemed distracted, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. She laughed at gatherings but drifted into silence when conversations turned toward money, jobs, or family challenges. Some chalked it up to stress, others to normal ups and downs. No one imagined that beneath the surface, she was spiraling into a darkness that threatened her entire family. The summer heat only seemed to magnify the tension. With each passing day, Emily became more irritable, snapping over minor issues. Her children noticed her growing unpredictability. Sometimes she was affectionate, almost overly so. Other times she withdrew completely, retreating into her room with her phone and laptop, shutting the door on the world. By July, Emily's double life, The smiling mother online and the overwhelmed woman in reality was slipping out of her control. Her carefully constructed image was no longer enough to conceal the cracks. Friends saw less of her. Her husband grew more distant. And at work, investigators were preparing questions that Emily could no longer evade. She was trapped between exposure and collapse. For someone who had spent years hiding behind appearances, the prospect of losing everything was unbearable. And it was in that unbearable silence that the darkest thoughts began to take shape, thoughts that would soon shatter the lives of everyone who loved her. The evening of August 15, 2025, began like any other in the quiet New Hampshire suburb. Neighbors described the Long household as calm from the outside, lights glowing in the living room, the faint sound of a television drifting into the warm night air. Nothing outwardly suggested that inside the house, a deadly storm was forming. Emily Long had spent much of the day in silence, moving mechanically through her routines. She prepared dinner, though she barely touched her own plate. Her husband, Michael, noticed her distracted gaze, the way she avoided eye contact, but he had grown accustomed to her distance in recent weeks. Their conversation was minimal, punctuated by the occasional murmur of the children, who quickly retreated to their rooms after eating. Behind her quiet demeanor, Emily's thoughts raced. The weight of discovery pressed against her chest. At work, the investigation into missing funds was accelerating, and whispers were already reaching management. She feared humiliation, arrest, and the shame of her children learning the truth. In her mind, the walls were closing in with no escape. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Emily sat alone at the kitchen table, her phone face down, untouched. She had spent weeks searching the internet for answers, reading stories of financial collapse and family breakdowns. The more she searched, the darker her conclusions became. To her, the future appeared ruined, her carefully constructed world ready to crumble at any moment. Around midnight, the neighborhood grew quiet. Porch lights dimmed. Crickets filled the silence outside. Inside the Long home, Emily moved quietly from room to room. Whether her family stirred or noticed her presence will never be known. Police later pieced together a chilling timeline, but the precise details remain locked in those final hours. What is known as this: sometime between midnight and the early morning hours, Emily acted. In the darkness of their home, she carried out a decision that investigators later described as both deliberate and devastating. Michael, asleep in their bedroom, never had the chance to resist. The children, resting in their rooms, were similarly defenseless. By dawn, the quiet suburban home that once seemed so ordinary had become the site of an unthinkable tragedy. At 7:12 a.m., a concerned coworker, alarmed by Emily's absence from a scheduled meeting, attempted to call her. The call went unanswered. A neighbor later reported noticing the family's car still in the driveway, unusual for a weekday morning. It wasn't until hours later that police, conducting a welfare check at the request of colleagues, stepped into the silent house and uncovered the horrific scene. Emily's body was discovered alongside those of her family members. Authorities quickly ruled it a murder-suicide. The grim details, withheld from the public out of respect for the victims, painted a picture of a mother who had crossed a line from desperation into irreversible violence. The news broke like a thunderclap. For neighbors, who had waved to Emily just days earlier, the revelation was unthinkable. For coworkers, who had known her as competent and composed, it was impossible to reconcile. And for investigators, it was the start of a search for answers in a case that seemed to defy reason. That night marked the end of the Long family's story. But for the community, and for the investigators tasked with piecing it together, it was only the beginning of a haunting chapter. When the first patrol officers stepped into the Long residence on the morning of August 16, 2025, they immediately sensed something was wrong. The house was unnaturally still. No children's voices, no signs of a bustling family preparing for the day, only silence, heavy and suffocating. The officers moved cautiously through the rooms, their radios crackling softly in the background. What they found confirmed their worst fears. One by one, they uncovered the lifeless bodies of Michael Long and the children. In the master bedroom, Emily was discovered, her death quickly determined to be self-inflicted. The grim realization hit: this was not an accident. It was a calculated act that had claimed an entire family. Police quickly secured the scene, stringing yellow tape around the neat suburban yard. Neighbors, drawn by flashing lights and the low hum of emergency vehicles, gathered in hushed clusters along the sidewalks. Whispers filled the air. Some asked if it was a burglary gone wrong. Others speculated about carbon monoxide poisoning. The truth, when it began to emerge, would be far darker. By midday, local news vans lined the street. Reporters spoke in solemn tones, their microphones framed by images of the quiet neighborhood, now transformed into a crime scene. Authorities have confirmed multiple fatalities inside this home, one reporter announced, her voice heavy. This appears to be a domestic incident. Police are not searching for any suspects at this time. The phrase domestic incident sent ripples through the community. People struggled to process what it meant. Friends of the family clutched one another in disbelief. Parents pulled their children closer, shaken by the thought that such horror could unfold in a house so similar to their own. Inside, detectives began the painstaking work of documenting evidence. They photographed rooms, collected electronic devices, and interviewed neighbors. One officer later admitted that the scene was among the most disturbing of his career. The fact that it had unfolded in a seemingly ordinary home only made it harder to comprehend. As the day wore on, the story spread beyond New Hampshire. Major networks picked it up, broadcasting images of the Long family's smiling faces, holiday photos, birthday celebrations, juxtaposed against the grim headline, "Mother kills husband, children, then herself." The contrast was jarring, and it sparked immediate questions. Why would Emily Long, a woman who appeared to have it all, take such a catastrophic step? What drove her to destroy not only her own life, but the lives of the people closest to her? In the days after the tragedy, investigators worked tirelessly to understand how an entire family could be wiped out in such a shocking way. Initial reports painted Emily Long as a devoted wife and mother. But as detectives dug deeper, a far more complicated portrait emerged. The first cracks appeared in her financial records. Bank statements revealed mounting credit card debt, tens of thousands of dollars accumulated in just the past year. Investigators traced large, unexplained withdrawals from her employer's accounts. At the insurance office where she worked, auditors confirmed what many had quietly suspected. Money was missing, and Emily was at the center of the discrepancies. It wasn't simply overspending, it was embezzlement. Emily had allegedly siphoned company funds, covering her tracks for months with careful manipulation. Yet her purchases left a trail: luxury handbags, high-end electronics, and home decor that far exceeded the family's budget. Investigators concluded that she was living beyond her means, unable, or unwilling, to stop. Colleagues described her as increasingly unstable in the weeks before her death. Once confident and composed, she became jittery and withdrawn. She avoided meetings, bristled at routine questions, and frequently disappeared into her office, closing the door behind her. When whispers of an internal investigation began circulating, Emily must have known her time was running out. Psychologists brought in to analyze the case later pointed to classic warning signs of a downward spiral. Emily had tied her self-worth to appearances, her family's image, her material possessions, her social media presence. When those pillars began to crack, she faced not just financial ruin, but what she perceived as total personal collapse. To someone already fragile, exposure may have felt like annihilation. The community, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the revelations emerging in the press. Friends remembered her as attentive at school events, always quick to volunteer, always smiling. "I can't believe she would do something like this," one neighbor told reporters, her voice trembling. "She loved those kids." National media outlets seized on the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about hidden pressures in suburban America. Commentators debated whether the tragedy was fueled by greed, mental illness, or a combination of both. Some criticized the stigmas around financial failure and depression, arguing that Emily may have felt she had no safe space to seek help. Others condemned her actions outright, insisting that no hardship could justify the destruction of innocent lives. The children's school became a focal point of mourning. Teachers wept openly. Friends left handwritten notes and flowers at the front gates, their drawings and messages taped to the fence. The innocence of youth collided with the brutality. For detectives, the picture was becoming clear. Emily Long had been cornered by her own deception. Facing exposure, legal consequences, and the collapse of her carefully constructed life, she made a choice that was as irreversible as it was devastating. But even with the facts laid bare, one question lingered in every conversation, every headline, every prayer. Why? Why had a mother chosen destruction over confession, finality over forgiveness? It was a question no investigation could ever fully answer. In the weeks following the discovery, the quiet neighborhood where the Long family once lived became a place of mourning. The house, now sealed off and silent, stood as a painful reminder of the lives lost inside. Neighbors avoided walking past, crossing the street instead, as though the weight of grief still radiated from its walls. Funeral services for Michael and the children drew hundreds. Friends, classmates, and extended relatives filled the church, their faces pale with sorrow. Teachers shared memories of the children's laughter, their bright futures cut short far too soon. Michael's colleagues remembered him as hard-working and kind, a man who never sought attention but always gave it. The grief in the room was palpable, and the tragedy's senselessness hung heavy in the air. Emily was buried quietly, away from the public service. Her role as both victim and perpetrator made her passing a subject of deep conflict. Some refused to acknowledge her memory, while others, despite condemning her actions, chose to pray for her soul, believing despair had consumed her before reason could reach her. The media attention faded gradually, but the community was left changed forever. Parents spoke more openly about financial stress, mental health, and the dangers of keeping up appearances. Schools hosted counselors, not only for children who had lost classmates, but for entire classrooms shaken by the thought that tragedy could strike so close to home. For Emily's employer, the scandal left scars as well. Beyond the financial damage, there were lessons about oversight, accountability, and how silent struggles can fester in plain sight. Co-workers, still haunted by guilt, wondered if they had missed an opportunity to intervene, if a kind word or a question asked at the right time might have altered the outcome. Psychologists who studied the case pointed to it as a stark example of the destructive power of shame. Emily Long's world had been built on image, online smiles, polished appearances, material possessions. When those foundations began to crack, she saw only collapse. Instead of reaching for help, she chose silence, and in that silence, despair met a talking point in national conversations about suburban pressures. Documentaries and podcasts dissected the case, searching for meaning in the senseless. Some framed it as a cautionary tale about financial secrecy, others as a stark reminder of the importance of mental health awareness. But for those who had known the family, no commentary could fill the void left by their absence. Years from now, people will remember the Longs not for the horror of their final night, but for the lives they lived before it. Children who laughed in schoolyards, a father who worked diligently for his family, and even a mother who, before her collapse, tried to maintain the image of happiness. Yet the darkness of their ending will always shadow their memory. The house eventually went up for sale, its cheerful exterior unable to mask the history within. For many, it stood as a warning. Appearances can be deceiving, and behind even the brightest windows, pain may lurk unseen. The tragedy of the Long family remains less about the crime itself, and more about the haunting question it leaves behind. What if someone had noticed? What if someone had reached out? Could it have changed everything?